Well, we could argue all day about the difference between Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase at the top two Dynasty wide receivers, but what do we do with the rest of the top 20? That and more today on the Dynasty Newsletter. I'm your host, Adam Wilde, joined by my co host, Chris Allen, in his Bengals hat, fitting for this topic. First, let's talk about Jamar Chase's teammate, Tee Higgins. So, we're going to go through some of the year two, year three wide receivers that have been doing well, at least this week or recently, and kind of where they're going to be ranked going into their third and fourth seasons next year. So Tee Higgins, a little up and down with injuries, but whenever he's been on the field, he's been fantastic. What do you think about his dynasty outlook going forward?
I would say that even if because the context of his situation moving forward with the team should be that, second rounder. So we're probably going to be, they're probably going to need to be discussing extensions because extensions for Burrow. They're probably going to have
Chase too.
Chase. So
and what happens when they extend Chase first?
Right. So there's going to be some conversations like down in Cincinnati that I'm probably not going to like as a Bengals fan. But overall, I do think that Tee Higgins is a receiver that, regardless of where he winds up, he could be another team's like wide receiver one. I don't think like that much is
a lot of other teams.
I would say like outside of, let's say, like the Seahawks, the 49ers, the Vikings, the Jets, and probably Buffalo, since I'm assuming like Stephon Diggs like has like a few more years left in him. But it's like, and then maybe Detroit and Philly. So there's maybe like a handful of teams. But even still,
he's probably the wide receiver one on like a good 20 teams.
Oh yeah, like without much of a doubt. Like from a yards per route run perspective, this is a study that I did in the offseason when the discussion about Tee Higgins, and this is from a best ball standpoint, like was even worthy of his average draft position in best ball leagues, because he was considered to be like the wide receiver two in Cincinnati, and his yards per route run, targets per route run, all comparable to other like top 12, like top 16, like wide receivers in the league. So from a route utilization standpoint, we were already seeing like Tee Higgins like being compared to like wide receiver ones. So I don't have any issue with considering him to be like in the, let's say, the top 12 of dynasty wide receivers. You could make the case for the rookies like this year, like moving at potentially moving ahead of them. Like we've seen Chris Olave and what his outlook is going to be.
Yeah, Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, Garrett Wilson. I think those two in particular, I think they make the easiest case. And maybe, just maybe, after yesterday, with the way that Desmond Ridder like looked to Drake London, you can probably talk yourself into the story where he sits like right behind T, like in the rankings. But overall, I think that it's easier to tell myself a story about Higgins continues to have at least wide receiver one like upside from a dynasty standpoint, just given his situation with the Bengals. And even if they do have contract negotiations which don't go his way and we don't continue to see him in the orange and black moving forward, wherever he winds up, he should still continue to be productive, because that doesn't change. Like those stripes, like for him to use a pun, like that's not going to change.
So he's got one more season under contract. Remember, he was a second round pick, so he doesn't have the 5th-year option. I'm just going to go out on a limb. I'm total guess. It feels like it's going to be the type of situation where he's probably franchise tagged if he doesn't get a deal done this offseason. You've seen with like elite receivers like this recently that they've been wanting to get those deals done like a year early. And when we haven't seen those deals done a year early, usually a change gets made. So the franchise tag seems likely to me because Jamar Chase is going to be so expensive, and they're going to want to definitely get him under contract earlier rather than later. So when the discussion comes up, hey, it's time to extend Tee Higgins, you're going to have people saying, well, we got to figure out Jamar Chase first. And well, if you've got to figure out Jamar Chase first, then that means that you're probably going to end up franchise tagging Tee Higgins. So probably 2 more years with the Bengals. And if we're already comfortable ranking him as a top 12 wide receiver behind quote unquote Jamar Chase, then we're going to be super happy when he like gets a mega contract and goes to another team that is looking for a weapon, sort of like AJ Brown did, which is going to be the next actually duo of receivers that we're going to talk about. So Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins, one of the best receiver duos in the league with one of the league's best quarterbacks. But we've got another two in this like sophomore junior range that also have one of the league's best quarterbacks in AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith. I would say they're in two separate tiers. AJ Brown probably in the second tier of wide receiver, depending on how you divvy up the top tier, whether you have Justin Jefferson in a tier of his own or not. But I think that Tee Higgins probably falls maybe third tier. So AJ Brown falls into a group of veteran wide receivers that we're super excited to have on their second contracts. He's got 4 years, I think, with the Eagles. So what do you think about AJ Brown going forward? And then let's just throw DeVonta Smith into the conversation, even knowing he's a few tiers down.
Right. I mean, but still, I think yesterday's game, for folks that watch like the Sunday game against Chicago, and even just the tear that they've been on over the past few weeks, I mean, there's no other, I mean, outside of maybe like the Miami duo, I mean, there are a few other teams that have such a concentrated target share, like between their primary wide receivers, and then there's everybody else. I mean, from a target share standpoint, and even just the efficiency that they can create on their own. I mean, the slot fade targets that DeVonta Smith was getting yesterday against Chicago. I mean, they were just, I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, Jalen Hurts injury aside, but that's more of a short term thing than a dynasty. Then something we need to take into consideration from a dynasty standpoint. I do think that it becomes easier for us to foresee Philadelphia continuing to use this model, like as Hurts continues to grow as a passer. So unless they plan to bring in, let's say, a Tyler Boyd-like option, which would be like their third option on the team, we don't care about their third wide receiver at this point. Zach Pascal, Quez Watkins, don't care. They're more of just run blockers because that's the type of system that they're employing, like in Philadelphia. So no, I mean, those two should be like at or close to, I mean, AJ Brown firmly like in the top 12, like most likely within like the top 6 for most folks, I would expect. But DeVonta Smith like probably comes in like right behind there, let's say at least within the top 20, just given the way that he's been able to create so far.
Yeah, DeVonta Smith is going to be an interesting topic because he fell into a range of like, okay, so in my mind, Terry McLaurin, someone who we're going to talk about in a little bit, of someone who like, and DJ Moore isn't going to be in this conversation due to his age and tenure in the league, but he's another person who we know the talent's there. We've seen the ceiling, but his supporting cast has not really allowed him to flourish. And it almost seemed like that's kind of what we were going to get. So DeVonta Smith hit a lot of the measurables that we wanted last year, but it just didn't seem exciting, especially since it took late into the year for him to really come on and look like a dominant wide receiver. And then they brought in AJ Brown. So it was really difficult to bring yourself to the point where you're saying, well, I think that DeVonta Smith is still a top 12 receiver. He has the draft capital, of course. Like I said, he hit all the marks in year one. There's really, and Jalen Hurts vastly improved as a passer, because one of the biggest knocks on DeVonta Smith last year would have been Jalen Hurts. And now he's went and become one of the best passers in the league on top of his rushing potential. So there's really no negatives for DeVonta Smith. AJ Brown coming in has only actually helped. So DeVonta Smith in the last like 4 or so weeks has been a wide receiver 1. And I think we could probably rely on that going forward. Of all the wide receivers that we're going to talk about today, I think the DeVonta Smith is the best one to try to target via trade, because he's never going to flash as like, he's got Tee Higgins upside, but he's never going to be a top 12 wide receiver. So
that's fair.
Very similar situations, and just doesn't have, it's not even that he doesn't have the name value. It's really hard to put into words how we feel about DeVonta Smith, because like I said, he was a top 15 draft pick, maybe even earlier than that. I'd have to think back.
Yeah,
but
like top 15. Yeah.
Yeah, early pick, and he's really hit all the marks that we've needed. Like I said, only negative AJ Brown coming in, and it's only helped his game, helped Jalen Hurts' game. So DeVonta Smith is somebody that we really need to consider as like, in my articles earlier in the year, actually I wrote about Jamar Chase, for example, and I said, look, it'd be fantastic to trade for Jamar Chase. Even if you trade for him at wide receiver 1 value, you're still probably winning the trade. The problem is, what does it do to your team when you have to give up 3 to 4 starters to obtain a player? Well, then you have to go down and try to look at players like Jaylen Waddle or DeVonta Smith. And this was before Jaylen Waddle's season this year. That's kind of out of the category, but DeVonta Smith is still there. So if you're looking at your team and you feel like you're a Jamar Chase away, if you try to trade for Jamar Chase, you're going to put yourself in a position where you're more than a Jamar Chase away by acquiring Jamar Chase. So that's
Right.
when you look to your players like DeVonta Smith as an excellent target, maybe not as flashy of a name, maybe not as exciting when you look at your roster at the beginning of the year, but when you look at your roster at the end of the year and you're still in the playoffs, it'll largely be due to the production you got at DeVonta Smith for the trade value that you gave up for him rather than giving up for a Jamar Chase. So just really an unsung hero of the top like 15 wide receivers in the league. And he's probably getting passed up by your Garrett Wilson,
Yeah.
Drake London, Chris Olave, probably all going to pass him up. But over the next 3 years, if he outscores all three, I'm not super surprised.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, and it's something that I've been thinking about like for season-long leagues, but I'm wondering like what the dynasty like application would be for it. So let me throw this at you like real quick. So like you were saying earlier, if you were to try and go get Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, I mean, more or less wide receiver ones on their respective teams, right? And trying to trade for them would more or less like put you in a hole regarding the draft capital and other assets you would have to give up in order to trade for either of those, right? But if you look to the 1Bs in the league, so
Sure.
the Tee Higgins, I think for right now, I mean, we'll see how many more years that Tyreek Hill like has in the tank. But if you want to throw like
Right.
Jaylen Waddle into the 1B category, T for sure. I mean, Chris Godwin for the time being, although it's a slightly different situation, but DeVonta Smith for sure fits in that role that we're talking about, like the younger 1Bs in the league. But they also have 1A or top 12 potential on a week-to-week basis.
Right.
I think that there's some merit to trying to move for those. Like if we're going to talk about like actionable takeaways like from this conversation, I mean, what do you think about that? I think that there's some merit to, instead of targeting those guys, like the guys like the Jamar Chases of the world and all that, and finding ways to maneuver for one of those, if you could just try and target one of the other guys, so the DeVonta Smiths and all that of the world, you can still create the potential for that same level of outcome. Because on a week-to-week basis, can Tee Higgins outscore Jamar Chase? Absolutely. Can DeVonta Smith match the production of AJ Brown on a week-to-week basis? Absolutely. But what it would need in order for you to acquire them is much less. So I'm wondering if that's a potential way for you to collect that much production without that much draft capital spent in order to get them.
Sure. Yeah. Something I try to do to contextualize this in my head a lot during the off season is I always attach like dollar values to players and such like that, just because that's how it makes sense to me, even kind of like the stock market. And everyone thinks about this thing different, but I think that there's certain things that add 10% to value, 15% to value. One thing is like if you're getting 65% of the snaps as your running back, like Ezekiel Elliott was worth more than Tony Pollard for quite some time, even though Tony Pollard seemed like the better player, more electric player, et cetera, that we're seeing now. But Ezekiel Elliott had that over 60% snap share, the quote unquote lead back role, et cetera. He gets that artificial 10% added. 15% always goes to the wide receiver one on the team because people feel better clicking the check mark next to their name. People are going to feel better about clicking Jamar Chase than Tee Higgins on a weekly basis. Can Tee Higgins outscore Jamar Chase? Absolutely, when they're both healthy. But people are going to feel better clicking on Jamar Chase. So you hit the nail on the head about something that I think about basically every offseason, which is like these players are getting these 10%, 15% value bumps because of these like stigmas, I guess you could say. Really they're a reality. Like Jamar Chase in reality is the wide receiver one, but
Sure.
is it worth paying 10% extra on top of his value just because he's the wide receiver one?
It
Probably
makes you feel
not.
better, doesn't it?
Right. And and is that worth it to you? And to some people it is. I'd
Mhm.
rather feel more comfortable give that 10% on top of what his added value over Tee Higgins already is, just because he's a wide receiver one on his team. Whereas
Mhm.
you can look to your Jaylen Waddles of the world. And this is why I was so quick to put Jaylen Waddle ahead of Tyreek Hill. Probably it sounds like I'm bragging, but I've missed plenty. Jaylen Waddle is probably the only one that I've gone super early on. Like I was super early on Juju. That was
Mhm.
terrible.
Right.
Right. But I was super early on drafting, ranking Jaylen Waddle really highly. And it's just because, yeah, I think that Tyreek Hill probably has a year or so of little added production for over Jaylen Waddle, but do I think that it's going to be enough to warrant the 4 or 5 extra years like age?
Yeah.
No, it probably wasn't. So yeah, you go after those 1Bs that just don't feel as good right now, but in 3 years, like you're gonna feel great. And then Tee Higgins, since we're on that one, in 3 years, Tee Higgins is on another team, and then he's in this. Would it be that crazy for him to be in the top tier of wide receivers on a different team?
Oh,
No, probably not. Let's say the Giants get a better quarterback and their only receiver is Tee Higgins. Yeah, he probably gets up in there and with that, with the Jamar Chases and the Justin Jeffersons and the AJ Browns and such.
but almost like taking the NFL, like the reality value, like into account. Because let's say that, I mean, what are the chances that Tee Higgins on his second contract winds up having a larger contract than Jamar Chase, like off of like after being rookie of the year, yada yada yada, like first round pick and all that. I mean, if we're already thinking that the NFL is going to be valuing them like more so, like if Jamar Chase is going to be valued like more so than Tee Higgins from an NFL standpoint, I mean, that's going to at least somewhat translate into how we view them from a dynasty standpoint.
Sure.
But if we can, again, going back to like the week to week volatility, I mean, unless you're playing in a dynasty best ball like type of league, if you can capture 80 to 90% like of that production of Jamar Chase, like for much less of a value that what you would have to pay in order to acquire him in dynasty. I mean, that's a proposition that almost any fantasy managers like would at least love to try and do.
Yep, I totally concur with that. Let's step away from this range of players and go a little bit deeper into the top 20 with the next two guys. Let's start with Michael Pittman. Had a decent game last week, and I just wrote up Michael Pittman. Anybody who's a Football Guy subscriber, if you want to check out Cutting Through the Noise, is a piece I do every week that's supposed to be an objective look at like the most polarizing players around the league. And I chose Michael Pittman. It's based off our Discord, but people were talking about Michael Pittman basically because, well, what the heck is going to happen in his environment? What is his surroundings going to look like going forward?
Mm-hmm.
And what I came away with in that piece is that, well, you probably have another year, Matt Ryan. He's got $18 million in dead cap next year. And that's in today's NFL, not an insane amount to drop a quarterback for. If you had to, I'm guessing they could get some sort of trade value, pay half of it, do like a Baker Mayfield type situation.
Sure.
But more than likely, they're just going to go with Matt Ryan going forward. And really, that hasn't been the worst thing. Like, he's not the worst quarterback in the league. He's not outside of the top 32. He's actually, I think, fifth in air yards this year, which was insane for me to think about. And so Michael Pittman's outlook was not actually as negative as I had figured, and I ended up thinking he was actually kind of a trade target at this point because his target share, fantastic. I mean, tops in the league. He's hit every mark. He's gotten better every year. I think even going back to freshman year in college, he's gotten better every single year. So going forward, he might be an interesting trade target. What do you think about Michael Pittman?
So I think that, so like we were talking about earlier, it's like the qualitative feeling that you get about rostering those types of players.
Yeah, it feels terrible. It's disgusting.
Yeah. But even if you were to like compare him to say like a Tee Higgins, it's like, how would you feel about rostering Tee Higgins versus Michael Pittman? Like some might say like, yeah, but like other folks, it's like, I would say it's a fair conversation to ask, like, who would you feel more comfortable rostering, like moving forward, like Tee Higgins or Michael Pittman, where their roles qualitatively speaking are much different. Michael Pittman,
sure,
without a doubt, the number one wide receiver like on his team. Like we do not care about Paris Campbell. I like what I've seen out of Alec Pierce like so far, but like none of the rest of the receivers or pass catching options matter outside of Jelani Woods, but that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
But for Tee Higgins, like we know his role, like 1B at best, like right next to Jamar Chase. So it's just, but still, like on a week-to-week basis, everybody will always go back to like if there's a tiebreaker, most folks will then go back to, well, who's passing the ball? And almost everybody's going to say they're going to want to roster somebody with Joe Burrow like throwing them the ball versus
Matt Ryan.
I mean, the cavalcade of just like busted quarterbacks that Indianapolis had to deal with over last. I mean, all respect like to what Phillip Rivers was trying to do, but like between Phillip Rivers to Carson Wentz and then now Matt Ryan, it's just that's where we sit. So it's much more easier for folks to cognitively look at the team situation and say, well, the Bengals team situation is so much better than trying to figure out whatever they're going to try and do at quarterback, at offensive line, insert hole here that is potentially an issue for the Colts passing offense versus just summarily saying, well, Michael Pittman gets all the targets. Michael Pittman is efficient with said targets, so we should roster him. When that should be the way we look at it. But again, qualitatively speaking, when you look at the two situations, most folks, if you just were to try and balance them, they'll be like, oh, well, I like what Cincinnati's doing right now, so I'm just going to go with Tee Higgins instead.
Yeah, and another thing that I pulled out of the Michael Pittman article was just that really as minus EV as Carson Wentz is as a quarterback, he should not have been that minus EV for a wide receiver. It's just that every area that Carson Wentz excelled in that should have been conducive to fantasy success for a wide receiver was like not Michael Pittman's game. I mean, he was like leading the league in deep targets. He was passing at like their pass rate was decent with Carson Wentz under center. Pretty much everything conducive to wide receiver success, but it's just that Michael Pittman is more of really that like possession wide receiver, lower A dot kind of guy. Would have done a lot better with good Matt Ryan. So when Matt Ryan signed, honestly, Matt Ryan was probably the perfect type of quarterback to play with Michael Pittman. I wrote in the article, prime Matt Ryan would have been the perfect quarterback for Michael Pittman. The problem is he's not prime Matt Ryan.
Right.
And some weeks he looks like he shouldn't even be in the NFL, Matt Ryan. But when it's all said and done and you count all the stats, he's actually been like okay enough to not just completely downgrade Michael Pittman out of your top 20. And Pittman's getting there. Like he's going to keep going down because there's nothing to be excited about. But when you try to look at the bright side of the situation, Jeff Saturday is not going to be the head coach next year. And the promising part about that, while unfortunate that he's going to lose his job, he'll be fine. He's going to go back to TV. He'll be great. But they don't have an offensive coordinator. They do not have a play caller right now.
Right.
So basically everything that they're putting on the field is just like, what? I don't know. Hope it works. So the ceiling is like, the floor is Middle Earth, and the ceiling is sky high, considering that right now they're operating with less than NFL caliber talent coaching them. So really right now is the best time. I mean, maybe in a week or two, best time to buy Michael Pittman. This offseason is going to be abysmal for him, considering how negative the team around him, the stink that the Colts organization is going to put on him, the largest comeback in history, yada, yada. Nothing good coming from the Colts organization. Sure, I'll trade for Michael Pittman right now and get top 15 production out of him. And it's just not going to feel as pretty as clicking on Tee Higgins, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's like I would say that there comes a time where vibes hold more weight or hold more value. Yeah, it's just because it's just like team vibes, like for comparable receivers, right? I'm not saying that Michael Pittman versus like, I don't know, like if you were to scroll down a little bit, like Michael Pittman versus like, or like Treylon Burks. I mean, if you want to throw somebody like into like a similar conversation or something,
right,
where it's like, the Tennessee Titans, like they could off ramp Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry over next year. So we could see the Titans passing game start to pick up over the next couple of years with those contracts that they could jettison if they choose to do so. But like the vibes could be fine with Tennessee, and people could be like, oh, well, Treylon Burks, like coming into his own, like Robert Woods, old, like Chiggy Okonkwo, cool and all, but still a tight end. But for Pittman, it's like, oh, vibes are bad in Indianapolis. So I'm with you there.
Yeah, it's crazy how much goes off vibes. I do understand that fantasy football is supposed to be fun for some people. So I would much rather have Tee Higgins just because I wouldn't want my team to average 20 points a game. But and that's the other thing that you do have to weigh too, like the offensive surroundings. We talk about the environment being such a big piece of the player value pie. And when you're averaging 25.5 points a game as opposed to a team that's averaging like 19, that adds up over time too. I mean, a touchdown a game adds up over time, and that will affect your wide receiver at some point as well.
Mhm.
Before we get to the last couple players, let's talk about the Football Guys newsletter brought to you by Dave Kluge, Cecil Lammy, Sigmund Bloom, and then it's going to come directly from Joe Bryant. It's going to update you on all the news and notes around the league. If you had to miss any of the any red zone, you had to run out to the store or something, you missed the craziest comeback of all time with the Vikings, I'm sure you will get that updated for you from the email newsletter. And then we take some tidbits from there that pertain to Dynasty, and we create this show, the Dynasty Newsletter. So please go to footballguys.com and subscribe to the email newsletter. A couple players we have left to talk about. Terry McLaurin still in that Michael Pittman category. He was in the news this week, but not necessarily for having a great game. He did okay, nothing special. But
conspiracy theorists unite.
It was that crazy. Like, I wish we could have the audio. Everyone knows what we're talking about.
He got my tinfoil hat.
He stepped forward.
The ref
like the ref said he was good, and then the ref snatched that like.
He was waiting. Boy, buddy was waiting to throw it.
That man snatched his flag like he practices throwing his flag in the mirror, and so kind of definitely hurt the Washington Commanders' chance of winning, and then the play after that, a big obvious pass interference.
Bets laid on the Giants. I know it.
That was tough. That was tough, and tied. They were tied in the division, literally tied 2 games ago, and then tied in the division. So that was insane. So Terry McLaurin, somebody who we'd like to get excited about, but for many of the same reasons as Michael Pittman, I think they're in the same ranking range as well. It's just like the team around him is abysmal. No good vibes. When we don't want to talk about vibes, literally the worst vibes in the league. And he's got Taylor Heineke throwing to him, which means that they have no plan at quarterback because Carson Wentz is under contract, and that's clearly not going well. So they're not going to get an early pick, so they're not going to get a rookie quarterback. So Terry McLaurin's going to remain in purgatory. I'd rather Matt Ryan going forward. So what do you think about Terry McLaurin and the Commanders?
Well, yeah, because I think you nailed it well there by saying it's just if we're going to go just based off of vibes, sure. Let's compare those exact same players that you were just talking about, like Michael Pittman versus Terry McLaurin. Without a doubt, like Terry McLaurin is the number 1 wide receiver on his team. Cool pieces around him, right? Jahan Dotson, excellent, like wide receiver 2 alongside him. Curtis Samuel, cool. Like all things considered. I mean, also excellent like ancillary receiver to play alongside of him. Even got a strong running game, similar to the Colts, right? I mean, like seeing like Brian Robinson, the big man with the big hat, still operating like behind Taylor Heineke, but still just like all those things like sound good like in theory, but once you start looking at like the vibes surrounding the team, and we'll like the whole Dan Snyder thing, we'll set that aside. But like the pass rate over expected for the team, one of the lowest in the league, like with Taylor Heineke, like they've been using Brian Robinson more as a battering ram and they've been apt to throw. So while Terry McLaurin has like the highest target share, like on the team, if the team's only passing like around 30 attempts like per game, that's not going to cut it. So I think that becomes the issue where target share, like relative target shares are cool, but then like target shares relative to the amount of passing attempts that your team actually has, like their pass rate over expectation, that becomes a consideration. And then of course the vibes. So then that just takes everything down. So if we're not even getting the same passing attempts like out of the Commanders as compared to the Colts, and then we're not seeing the same production out of the Commanders like as we would for the Colts. So it's just like if the vibes are completely down, then of course that's where you find Terry McLaurin at a lesser tier than Michael Pittman. Of course, and also, I mean, Terry McLaurin is 3 years older than Michael. He's like 20. Like I know McLaurin's 27 now.
Yeah,
he's still entering his prime.
Pittman's 25, I think. So
yeah, so still entering his prime, like as a wide receiver. But then when you take that into account, along with the vibes, then that's where things change.
Yeah, we need to get a vibes chart going. Yeah, so
analytics.
The Commanders just have no.
Where's Peter Howard at to start charting vibes?
A nice heat chart for us.
Yeah.
Just the Commanders having no direction going forward. I mean, making the playoffs and exiting in the first round's fantastic and all, but by the time Terry McLaurin's out of this, like he's going to have a wasted career unless he gets out of Washington and he signed an extension. So good luck with that. You know what I mean? It's going to be.
Yeah.
What if we could see Terry McLaurin with Joe Burrow, right? How fantastic would that be? How different would the conversation be, et cetera? Fantastic hit for them and Terry McLaurin. Great player, but it's just going to be tough. I mean, we see some light at the end of the tunnel for Michael Pittman. It's not there for Terry McLaurin. A couple players that we wanted to talk about is Waddle and CeeDee, and let's kind of compare those two players, because that was the tough decision I had when I was like, how high can I get Jaylen Waddle in my dynasty rankings? And I just kept moving them up and moving them up. I think I got them all the way up to 9, and the tough decision was CeeDee Lamb or Jaylen Waddle. And there you go again with technically Jaylen Waddle's the 1B, and
Sure.
CeeDee Lamb is the 1. Just one. No 1B, no nothing, just the 1. But Jaylen Waddle has really, in my opinion, done more with his opportunity in his 2 years than we've seen from CeeDee Lamb in his 3. CeeDee Lamb will come on every once in a while, but he really leaves you in the dust sometimes too. So besides a few games of injury, Jaylen Waddle's been very consistent for us. What do you think about the difference between those two?
Well, I think that's the moniker that each has, like for their team, is the only thing that sets them apart. I mean, good quarterback, sure. Efficient quarterbacking, absolutely. I mean, are they capable of like having like those big games as well? Yep. I mean, all things. I mean, all those things are there like for both of them. It's just that one has another dynasty like wide receiver 1 alongside of him in Tyreek Hill, and the other one has Michael Gallup and Peyton Hendershot like behind him.
Don't forget T.Y. Hilton.
Right, and T.Y. Hilton like competing, and the specter of potentially
James
Odell
Washington.
Beckham, and like also like, but that's the difference, right? Like, because even I think CeeDee Lamb's biggest the concern for CeeDee Lamb is, can he earn targets at the same rate as an AJ Brown, as a Tyreek Hill, and all that? While that really hasn't been the case, because we have seen guys like Peyton Hendershot and Dalton Schultz and Noah Brown like pop up for big games. I wouldn't say the same target utilization has been there, but we know who's like getting the majority of the targets. I think that's just been the biggest concern for me, like for CeeDee Lamb. But now without Amari Cooper in the fold, I think it's easier for me to tell myself a story about CeeDee Lamb, like maintaining his like wide receiver 1 outlook, like in the dynasty rankings, and versus, Jaylen Waddle, who should still be a wide receiver 1, but it'll always just have that lesser, again, the vibes check. It's that role that they got on their team, which would always make folks want to click CeeDee Lamb over Jaylen Waddle.
Another thing worth considering is that CeeDee Lamb's actually still younger than Jaylen Waddle, even though I think he was the year prior, right?
Yeah.
So, I think CeeDee Lamb came out the year earlier. And so it's worth considering. He's still younger. And like you said, the scoring offenses are actually pretty much the same, which is not something that I considered going into the season. I did not think that the Miami Dolphins were going to be on par scoring with the Dallas Cowboys. Turns out that they are. So that's a check in the favor of Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle's let us down some this year too. But we have to consider he played through injury for about 3 games, and he still was last week when he went off for 112 yards and a touch. So it's really hard to contextualize one season. It's really over a career. So like when we cap off the whole vibes episode with like, how do you rank CeeDee Lamb or Jaylen Waddle? I guess you flip a coin. Like change your mind every week and eventually you'll be right. It's really difficult, and that really encapsulates the whole conversation, where the only difference is that one's the quote unquote wide receiver 1 and one's the quote unquote wide receiver 2 on their teams. But they're really similar in targets I'm seeing here. CeeDee Lamb is probably out targeting him because of the like down 4 or 5 games that Waddle's had with that injury. But if you really contextualize the season, I'm looking here, the target shares are actually relatively similar, even though, and that's really because no one can buy a target for the Miami Dolphins outside of Waddle and Tyreek Hill. Like, right. I really think that, like, I was about to say, I think that Trent Sherfield is really like, he's got hundreds in his sock, and he's just like, I will literally give you $100 if you pass me one ball. And that's probably the only way that he gets his targets, is just by bribing Tua, because all he wants to do is pass to Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. And really, you can blame him. I think Mike Gesicki just had a 4-game streak broken of no targets, and he finally got one last week. So no one else is getting the ball there. So that's kind of crazy too. What do you even care? Do you care that he's not the wide receiver 1? You really care about the targets, right? So does it even matter? So, if Jaylen Waddle's coming at a discount, then you give me Jaylen Waddle at a discount over CeeDee Lamb. And there you go. There's your argument. Yeah. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you all so much for coming out. This has been Dynasty Newsletter, brought to you by Footballguys.com. Please like, subscribe, rate, review. Check us out on Spotify. We have our own channel over there. So look up Dynasty Newsletter on Spotify and you will find us. We will catch y'all next week. Peace.